If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. I'm curious at this point about what does our IT actually do for us? What does our desktop technology actually do for us in terms of productivity? Thinking about how we as knowledge workers can be more productive. And so this episode is about the productivity paradox. And the productivity paradox, if you're not familiar, it's been around for a while. And it's economists' way of saying we don't see productivity value coming back from our investment in IT, particularly, in my mind, in desktop IT. So the question is, companies and people have invested a ton of cash in desktop IT, I'll say. And over the 40 years we've been doing it, we really are not seeing any productivity increases. And a little background on this question. Most analysts believe that we saw a huge productivity increase that was driven by the large investment in industry, the large investment in factory automation, if you will. So the productivity of manual labor, and that's in Peter Drucker's terms, increased dramatically through the entire 20th century, really. It may have tailed off a little bit there at the end as we began to shift to knowledge work. So with that background, economists being economists, they're continuing to look for the same kind of thing based on our IT investment. And they're simply not seeing it in the larger aggregate productivity numbers at the national level, at the gross national product level. This is a real curious idea because we want to think about these tools as helping us do things. And how does that work in knowledge work? And I want to think at the individual level about your productivity and how do we use the tools that we've got to be more productive. In this post, we'll talk about desktop stuff, desktop IT as being the height of knowledge worker productivity tools, of knowledge worker technology. When I say desktop, I don't mean desktop versus laptop. I just mean office kind of stuff. If you have a home office, you've decked it out with processing power and multiple screens and keyboards and printers and things. Are you actually more productive because of this? I would say that economists believe that we're not. I would say that at the personal level, there's certainly plenty of anecdotal evidence that we're not really more productive than we once were. I wonder if the problem is not how we're going about it. I think maybe we are going about it in the wrong ways. And if so, then since most of us are probably not programmers and don't create the next great app or the next great operating system, what can we as individuals do about it? What can we as users of this technology understand differently? And can we gain productivity advantages out of the existing technology? If we agree with the economists who say that we're really not seeing a productivity increase, then I want to talk about why, and maybe that'll lead us to a solution. And I'll talk about what that why is, and there's several reasons, I believe, and I'll get into those in a minute. And then we'll follow up with some actionable steps to help us individually be productive. And I would say the data show that if you're thinking computing desktop IT by itself makes you more productive, at this point, I don't believe that. And I believe that we can add in some, if you will, secret sauce and make our current technology into a tool that will at least make us unusually productive. And I'll talk about what that means as well, unusually productive in the work world. And I think the good news, I think the takeaway here is that we can gain an advantage if we thoughtfully apply the technology and we think about where the technology helps us and where it doesn't, and then devise different schemes. And we'll talk about what all that is as we go further. The core of my argument is that the desktop computing environment really doesn't seem to have changed the way that we work. So engage with me in a thought experiment. If we were able to resurrect an office worker from, say, 70 years ago, 1950s, and bring them forward into the modern technology era, would they or would they not be wildly more productive? In my mind, the answer to that question is no, they would not be wildly more productive. Even once we gave them a time to adjust to the gee whiz cool thing that we've got with monitors and wireless stuff, and they're going to have questions. But I don't know that we would really see a huge difference in their productivity in terms of what their job is, in terms of what they actually deliver in the world. And I'll give a few examples. In, I'll say, 40 years of deploying this expensive technology, we haven't actually gotten rid of paper. We, in some ways, have reduced the need for pieces of paper, but we really haven't changed the fact that we're still very document centric. And I think we've brought the constraints of documents, including the paper constraints, forward with us into the new technology. But after 40 years, a document is still a document. We're still producing these combinations of words and at least appearing to be pages with headers and these different kinds of ideas. And so nobody from 70 years ago, you show them a document you created yesterday on all this modern technology, and they'd be impressed that it wasn't typed. But beyond that, would they be impressed with the quality of the writing? Would they be impressed with the content of the document? Would they have to have training in order to understand how we produce our work? And the answer to all those is no. So documents are still documents. Another point I'll bring up is that email is simply faster correspondence. And I use the word correspondence for a reason, because correspondence is this exchange of written thought back and forth. Correspondence itself hasn't changed, nor have we moved away from it. It's just that our correspondence is faster. It's faster, but it's not fast enough to be synchronous. Well, maybe it's fast enough to be synchronous, but we don't use it in ways that are actually synchronous. And then finally, I'll say all of the technology that's available to you is also available to me. 95%. We spend the same kind of money on our technology. We have the same kind of tools that we use. And if everybody is gaining the same productivity move, then it's hard to say that it's impacted us individually. So you're on the interstate And for whatever reason, the speed limit's 55 and you're cruising along with the same cars. Well, if the speed limit goes up to 70, we're all getting where we're going faster, but we're all still getting there together. And that's the thinking here. The technology is so widespread. And so I'll say kind of least common denominator, that it can't provide anybody with a real differential advantage unless we use it differently. And I'll help us think about some ways to use it differently. So I give those examples to say everything has not changed. Most people would say, well, the world has changed. Well, the world has changed in certain ways. Are those ways making us more productive? And that's the question we want to address here. I'd say there are many things that haven't changed in any sort of a fundamental way. One is we had the opportunity to redesign our processes and systems in such a way that we took advantage of IT. And I'll make this very clear by talking about a line of thinking that was going around in the 90s. And it went under the name of business process reengineering, or BPR as the acronym. And BPR was this notion that if we just applied technology to existing processes, then we were losing out in two ways. One way was that we weren't taking advantage of the ability to improve because of the technology. And two is we were actually cementing the existing processes. So the notion was we don't want to be paving cow paths. And the metaphor comes from the fact that many streets in history were developed from tracks that people used. They weren't planned. They weren't optimized for any particular purpose. It was just, well, people go this way, so let's put down some paving so their feet don't get dirty. Well, people had found the easy ways, not the most efficient ways, but the easy ways to travel. And usually that was where, in the metaphor, the cows had gone through the forest repeatedly and knocked down all the brush. The great thing about a cow path is you don't get lost. The bad thing about a cow path is that it's not an efficient directional thing. It meanders and wanders. And the paving part is really interesting because once you've paved it, you've added cost to it, which from an economist perspective makes it even harder to change. If you want to build a sidewalk that doesn't follow the cow path, then having a sidewalk that does follow the cow path is an interference in making the new sidewalk. So that was the notion of business process reengineering. And in my mind, very few companies actually re-engineered their processes for IT. I don't mean that they didn't apply IT to processes, but they didn't fundamentally re-engineer their processes to take advantage of IT, particularly at the knowledge worker level. Now, in many cases, we have utilized big IT, organizational level IT, to change the way we do certain things within a business. But we didn't extend that to the core processes, and particularly the processes that help us move knowledge. And back to my example of email. Email does nothing to change the nature of asynchronous communication. And it does nothing to turn asynchronous communication into synchronous communication. But instead, what we did was make asynchronous communication or correspondence a lot faster. Well, what kind of improvement is that? And so we'll think about them, and we'll think about these underlying models a little bit. So that's business process reengineering. We thought about doing it, and a few people talked about doing it, but even fewer people actually did it. And we've never rebuilt our business processes from the ground up to reflect the capabilities of particularly desktop technology. What else has stayed the same? Well, let's think about the technology itself. If you look at your operating system, Windows or Mac or whatever you use, nothing has changed fundamentally about operating systems, I'll say, since Windows 3.11 in 1993. And that's when we got icons and windowed multitasking, and these kinds of ideas came online. Since 1993, we've gotten much better graphics. Our windows are prettier and our icons are more detailed. But we haven't changed the way the operating system works dramatically. We've made adaptations to faster hardware. We've gone from 32-bit to 64-bit. But these things haven't fundamentally altered the productivity impact of computing. And when we look at operating systems, one of the really interesting things about an operating system is its metaphor. And I cover metaphors in episode 29 from a couple of months ago. And so if you're interested, you can see that. But certainly the desktop operating system metaphor has not changed in 30 years. We still think in terms of files and folders, documents, and that hasn't changed. And so I think this is one of the things, if you brought somebody forward from, 1994 and you showed them the modern operating system environment, I don't think they'd be terribly impressed. I think they'd be interested in, oh, it's a lot prettier. And, oh, we solved the multiple monitor problem. It's smoother. But am I more productive? Am I better at what I do because I can do this now? And I think their answer would probably be, well, not really. As an example of how operating systems might change, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, one of the things about the desktop operating system metaphor is if you want to do something, the first thing you do is create a file. And that file is specifically associated with some app, some way to use it. You either create, and I'll just simplify it here, you either create a Word document or you create an Excel spreadsheet. And you largely do it from scratch. So when you get to the computer, in order to be able to start your work, you have to decide what the result of your work is going to be. And there's no way just to walk up to a computer and dump information to it. The mobile technology has made some advancement here in the term that we can use voice. So we don't have to go through waking the computer up, sitting down in the chair, opening up a file to then put our information into. But I'd say that's an incremental improvement rather than some massive improvement, because what do you have to tell your voice response? What do you have to tell Siri? Hey, Siri, create an email and say whatever it is I need to say. And so the app is still front and center in terms of the way to store information that we want to put into the computer. So that really hasn't changed, at least in the last 30 years. People say mobile technology is great. Well, I like mobile technology just like everybody else. But I'll argue that neither wireless within the office or within the structure, right? Wi-Fi or mobile has really changed much of anything. And one thing I'll say about this is that we have largely the same apps and metaphors on mobile that we have at the desktop. The real advent of chat, which is now on the computer, the real advent of chat is texting. And texting, SMS texting on a mobile is just the text version of leaving somebody a voicemail. It's still asynchronous. And instead of talking to it, and I know that you can talk to the text thing through Siri or whatever your device is, but it's just translating it into text versus an audio file. But you're still putting your idea out there for the other person to interpret and consume without you being there to help them. So in many fundamental ways, text is not better than leaving a voicemail, and voicemail technology has been around for more like 50 years. Anybody know what an answering machine is? Well, that's voicemail. And you could argue that voicemail has actually gotten a little bit harder to do. And then we say, well, how else do we interact with our desktop technology? What else is going on? And then we immediately think about our peripheral devices. So how is it that we interact with the computer? Well, I sit here looking, and I've got a keyboard that's wireless. And I've got a split keyboard because I think it's ergonomically better. But it's still a QWERTY layout. And the QWERTY layout has been around for close to 150 years. And those of you that know the backstory of the QWERTY layout, it was actually designed to slow typists down. Because in mechanical keyboards, if you hit two keys at the same time, both the keys throw and they get tangled up or they mess up the paper or whatever's going on. And it was actually designed to prevent those collisions from happening. And that's a little bit of a red herring because once you learn the layout, it really doesn't matter. There's nothing magical about laying out a keyboard in ABC order, despite what Dvorak might have had to say about this. The Dvorak keyboard was actually designed to lower effort rather than to increase speed. Peripherals, keyboard. Well, what's the other primary peripheral? Well, you have a pointing device, a mouse in most cases. I'd say the big three are mouse, trackball, touchpad, not in that order. And I have a trackball. I have a trackball for ergonomic reasons. But the mouse, the idea of the mouse and commercially available mouses, the mouse has been commercially available since 1981. And it hasn't changed dramatically. A trackball is not a dramatic change to a mouse. Fundamentally, it just is a mouse flipped on its side. So instead of letting the ball ride on the desk, you're managing the ball directly with your thumb, and the buttons are on the side. And nothing fundamental has changed. The fact that we needed a pointing device to interact with a computer was a pretty big change at the time. But in the last, now what are we talking about? 40 years, it hasn't changed in any real way. So our peripherals are not helping us interact with computers any more than they did 35 years ago. So then, okay, let's look at, well, we've talked about operating system and we've talked about the mobile and we've talked about peripherals. So now we're in the age where AI is sucking up a lot of the press. So the AI question is it different? Is it better? Or is it just faster for the same old, same old? And there's a good argument to be had here. We can make points either way. I think the jury is still out on whether or not AI is going to make us dramatically more productive. But I will say that the nature of AI is that it reproduces what's already out there. And it can help us conform to existing rules. For example, a grammar checker. It's not really AI, but a grammar checker simply helps us avoid mistakes. Now, is avoiding mistakes a huge productivity advantage? It's an improvement, but it's incremental at best. It's not doing anything for you that you couldn't do for yourself. It's just doing it somewhat faster. So I'll leave the AI question there, that it's an open question still. And I don't know of anybody that's thoughtful about this stuff that's saying, oh, AI is going to change knowledge worker productivity. It makes us faster, and it can generate photos for you so that you don't have to generate them yourself. But is that some dramatic improvement in our productivity? So underlying, theoretically, why are we faced with this? And I'll say one of the whys is that, I'll use a phrase, radical is not the plural of incremental. There's not enough incremental to get radical, despite what we may believe. There's several problems with incremental advancement and incremental change. And one of them is incremental change tends to force us into a local optimum. And evolutionary science talks about local optimums, and change management talks about local optimums or local optima. The point is that on any upsloping line, there are bumps, there are ups and downs. Think about the stock market. Even if the general trend is upward, there are smaller movements up and down. And when we look at incremental improvement, then we tend to be climbing the uphill slope of a local bump. And when we get to the top of that bump, we look around and we go, okay, anything that we do, any advancement that we make is going to make us somewhat worse. So we don't adopt that. And in order to jump across that downslope and get on the next upslope, we have to do something that either is accidental or somewhat irrational. I did an episode on the J curve in the last few weeks, and the J curve is this notion of it's an engineering principle that you're going to get a little worse before you get any better. And that, again, is a function of the local optimum. And so, if you have read the press and you believe a Dvorak keyboard is better than a QWERTY keyboard, then why haven't you adopted a Dvorak keyboard? Well, I would argue it's at least in part because of the J curve. You're going to get worse before you get any better. And taking that long-term perspective is very challenging for us. But I'll just say that it's easy to believe that enough incremental improvements produce something radical, but it doesn't appear to be so. The other thing, so radical is not the plural of increment. The other thing I'll say is I don't think that faster by itself gives us more productivity. Now, I'll break that down into a couple of different thoughts. Faster certainly does not give us differential productivity. because we all have the same technology. I alluded to this a minute ago. We all got faster to the same degree at the same time. And just in economist terms, we compete with each other. And I go back to the speed limit example. You don't move away from the cars you were with just because the speed limit went up 15 miles an hour. Because then everybody's going 15 miles an hour faster. So faster by itself, because of the way faster is delivered to us, it can help everybody in the class, but it's not helping anybody in particular. And then the other thing, I don't think faster by itself gives us more productivity. Faster is easy. You can throw money at faster. You can easily engineer faster. We've been doing it with computer chips for 40 odd years now, maybe more. And each new chip design has gotten faster and faster and faster. Now, do we have an asymptote that we're approaching where our speed changes are going to level out? Probably. We don't know where it is, but that's probably true. And then will we make a switch to something like quantum computing? Maybe. But just faster is incremental. It's a little bit faster every time. And that doesn't amount to radical. Now, I'll talk a little bit here coming up about bad habits that we get from the technology, bad habits of thought that we get from the technology. But, the primary one is, when I say I don't think faster by itself gives us more productivity, another challenge there is that if we believe that faster makes us more productive, then we're prone to think that our primary input is time. And as you have heard, if you've listened to any other episodes, I don't think that time is the right way to manage our productivity. But even if it is, then we haven't gotten a whole lot faster where it counts. In knowledge work, it's still our brains that do the work. And the technology really hasn't done a lot to change that. The technology has really not done a lot to substitute for that. And this is where we get back to the AI argument. And as I said, AI for me is still an open question of whether or not it will actually improve productivity. So I mentioned bad habits that we get from the trajectory of technology. One of those bad habits, I'll say, is that newer is better. And that's an easy thing to think. And some of it comes from the fact that physical things wear out. So if you let's say you bought 2 cars 5 years ago, exact same model. And for 5 years, you've been driving one of them every day, and the other one you've kept in a warehouse somewhere and done a little bit of maintenance on it. Just by the nature of physical things, the one you've been driving has degraded. And the one that is, and I'm using air quotes here, the one that is newer is probably better in measurable ways. Perhaps over time, the gas mileage that an engine delivers decreases as it wears. Maybe, through just normal wear and tear, the seats on the car you've been using are kind of messed up and maybe torn or stained or whatever. And you get in the, again, newer, air quotes, version of the same car, and it's somewhat better. And I think this, along with the continued release of new IT products, makes us think that newer is better. And in fact, newer is usually faster by some measure, but that by itself is not better. Oh, and we'll talk about the whole business of newer being faster here in just a minute. I think another bad habit that we get from technology is multitasking. And my evidence here is that multitasking was not even a thing. We didn't even talk about multitasking until we got computers that could start doing it. And then we as humans thought, well, if a computer can multitask, then certainly a human can multitask. And I'm very much on record as saying the science has demonstrated over and over again that humans are very poor multitaskers. And so it's easy to get a bad idea about this from the technology. And then, as I said, focusing on time as the primary input to productivity. And out there from the distant reaches of the webosphere, I hear, but Larry, it's faster. And I'll even argue that. So we're all familiar with Moore's law, which is the speed of computer hardware doubles roughly every 2 years. I don't know if it still holds, but it held at one time. But the one that people don't hear as much about is it's attributed to various people, but I like to think of it as Gates's law, which is because of the way apps are built and designed, in 18 months, the app itself is going to take twice as long to do anything. Now, both of these are kind of rules of thumb, but it's quite obvious to me that the notion of firing up a new document hasn't changed noticeably in the last 30 years. Our hardware has gotten faster, but our software has gotten bigger with more features, and it does more as it's cranking itself up. And a lot of this is stuff that you'll never use. A lot of the stuff is getting ready is as it's coming online, as your new document is being created and the app is booting itself, so to speak. It's doing a lot of stuff and it's preparing for things that you'll never need. But there's no way to tell the app not to do that. So Moore's law and Gates's law combat with each other. And one quote that I saw as I was doing this research, it said, what, Andy Grove of Intel, what Andy giveth, Bill Gates of Microsoft taketh away. And so what the hardware produces gets sucked up in new features and the speed doesn't get delivered to us. But it's faster. You got more gigabits on wireless, but you're also sending more data. So have we gotten faster? So all of these are bad habits that we get from what we believe about technology and productivity. So what do we do about this? Well, we're kind of stuck because most of us don't have the capability to change our operating system or our apps or our peripherals. We can swap out an old one for a new one, and you can buy a split keyboard instead of a single keyboard, and you can move from QWERTY to Dvorak. But most of us can't change the nature of a keyboard. Most of us can't change the fact that our operating system is intended to work with some pointing device, and that's usually a mouse. I'm aware of some research into eye tracking so that we don't need to move the pointer, that the camera will track our eyes and move the pointer automatically, and then we can just start doing what we do, maybe, but that's not online yet. So we can't do very much. So what do we do about it? Well, I would say we address technology in our world, and I won't quite go as far as Cal Newport and his digital minimalism movement, although I think that's a good idea. I will just bring up a couple of points. One is that switching apps is very costly, and we get much the same feature set at the level that we're talking about today. Do we get a few additional features? Yes. Is something maybe prettier? Yes, it is. But it's unusual for one app to work dramatically differently than another. And there are exceptions, but the exceptions are hard to find. So, switching apps is very costly. And even updates to existing apps can be very costly. If you've been using an interface for some extended period of time and they move one of the buttons you use pretty often, I'm sorry, if there's a button that you use pretty often that then gets moved, well, you have to relearn the motor skills to be fast again. And many updates will do this. Many of the updates now are actually harmful to our productivity because many of the updates we receive now include some sort of ad model that's built in, and that's actually a distraction to us. And so we adopt this. And, I'll say we still have some control. This is why I talked about switching applications versus taking upgrades, because we're losing control over taking upgrades. Whether we want the upgrades or not, we're most likely going to get them. But we do have control over switching apps. And we've talked for a while about this notion of people who continually switch systems in order to try to find the perfect system that will give them, in my case, productivity. And that's really not a great move because it's so costly to switch in terms of our attention, in terms of our habits, in terms of the learning curve we probably face. I'll also say that if we want to be, again, differentially productive, then we need to do different things than everybody else is doing. And I often quote Dave Ramsey, I'll quote him again. If you do what you see everybody else doing, you'll be just as productive as they are, which ain't great. But I do think that there are opportunities, and I think they're in specific areas of how we use technology. And the first is common for me. The first opportunity is to manage your attention, not your time. And stop automatically believing that faster is equal to more productive. At best, the correlation is not great. And it's certainly not automatic that just because you got faster means that you're better. And that's a function of believing that the input to productivity is time. I believe there's another opportunity in understanding that apps are not usually written for improved productivity, but they're usually written for improved speed. And by that, I mean that they do what they do faster. And this is particularly true in updates. Now, we talked about Gates's law, which works against this, but most of the time, it's very expensive to change what an app does, both in dollar terms and in psychological terms. And so new releases add new features, but most features that we have, we don't use. So as we're thinking about, oh, well, I'll just pick the latest and greatest app, or I'll take the latest and greatest upgrade, and that'll make me more productive. Well, it probably won't. In the short term, it could easily make you less productive. And in the long term, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but most likely it won't. And so thinking about that and just not believing automatically that anything is written for your improved productivity, although that's often a claim with software and different apps. Most apps are written so that you'll use them more. And that's for economic reasons that we won't chase that rabbit right now. I think I said this before, just because technology is new doesn't mean it's better. If you need to relearn things, then think hard before you update. Now, that's a real challenge because very seldom do we understand what an update does before we accept the update. And then we've got a whole new cost of, well, can I roll back? How hard is it to roll back? I don't know the process of rolling back, all these kinds of ideas. But I would say be more guarded about new versions and the latest and greatest. I went from, and this has just been in the last couple of years, I bought my first car, which tells you something about my driving. I bought my first car with a remote key. So I don't need to put a piece of metal in the steering column in order to start my car. Is it more convenient? Yes, it is. I don't have to fish my keys out. But over 40 years of driving, I had figured out efficient ways to deal with my keys. But the remote key poses different challenges. For example, my remote key is very sensitive. And many times I'll walk from my office to the garage after having put my remote key in my pocket and the windows of my car will be down. It happened to me one time when I was out and about. Fortunately, it wasn't raining, but I had somehow hit a button on my key fob that rolled down the windows. Well, I didn't ask for that feature. I can't imagine that that would be a real productive feature to have. And I live in Alabama. When we get in cars around here in the summertime, it's hot in there. But it's just never something that I thought would be useful. Is it maybe an incremental improvement? Maybe, if it's not raining. But the cost of an error here is actually pretty high. So just because it's new doesn't mean it's good, particularly if you need to relearn it. So be a little more thoughtful about updating and changing apps. Another thought here, and this may not be perfectly on topic, but another thought is learn the features of the apps that you have. Do this judiciously, but be aware of, study the apps that you have a little bit and see what they'll do for you. And before you adopt this new feature, think about it. Does it make me better? Does it make me more productive? Or does it just do something I'm already doing a little bit faster? And use your own judgment with the caveat that faster by itself probably doesn't make you more productive. If you're a knowledge worker, I would say look to improve the processes that don't involve your computer. Look to improve your use of your primary productive asset, which is your brain. Look to have new mental models. Look to improve your focus. Do some of these things that are outside of the computer. We think of technology as being the only way we can get better. And we've fallen away from other ways to get better. This goes back to a couple of ideas. One is you probably don't have enough control over your computer environment to make meaningful change. Well, I can choose a different app. Yes, you can choose a different app, but it probably does the same thing. You can switch brands of potato chip and you're not gonna get a vegetable, right? So you probably don't have enough control over your IT environment to make real meaningful changes. And I always think about the fact that, errors cost you more than speed gains you. And I talked about this in a previous episode. I have a wireless printer in my house, and the wireless printer has two primary flaws. One is that I use it as a scanner, and I'll put a document in and it'll run me through I think it's 6 button presses to confirm that I actually want to scan something. And I'll push the sixth one and it'll think for a couple of seconds and it'll say scan failed. And it doesn't give a reason. And I've learned that if I go through the same set of motions 2, 3, 4 times, then it'll do it. Nothing changes. The software, I've begun to think of it of I'm not asking the right way. And I have to say, pretty please, and do this 3 times before it believes I'm serious and actually want to scan a document. But one of those errors costs me a lot in terms of my productivity and time. And I've planned for it to be a quick operation, and it's not. So it can take me 3 or 4 minutes to start the scan of the document. Well, is it worth 3 or 4 minutes to get your document scanned? Well, I hadn't thought about it in those terms. It may be, but it's certainly not as radical if it takes 3 minutes than it is if it takes 3 seconds. So think about these kinds of ideas. The other thing about the printer that I have, and since I'm complaining, I'll complain one more time, is it just drops its wireless connection for no particular reason. It doesn't tell me that it's dropped. For whatever reason, the printer doesn't think it's lost its connection, but the computer thinks the printer has lost its connection. Well, what? So if I encountered this particular error, then my only recourse so far that I found is to unplug the computer, or unplug the printer, I should say, and plug it back in. Well, that takes 2 minutes. Well, I expected it to take 2 seconds. I expected to click the print button and okay. And instead, I'm over here unplugging and plugging the computer. And fortunately, it's right here beside my desk, which sort of limits the whole idea of having a wireless computer anyway, a wireless printer. But I've talked about this, I think, in another episode. Another thing that I'll encourage you to think about is file storage. Is there some better way to store files? Now, all the operating systems have the same file storage, theory, metaphor, folders and folders and subfolders. But is there a better way to utilize that so that you can find stuff more easily and not spend so much of your attention scrounging around to try to find something that you're pretty sure you knew where it was? That's an expensive step. So I'll conclude with a section on what I've learned about all this from my work with Attention Compass and helping clients get better at productivity. So one thing I've learned is to have a single app that you can dump to just to record your ideas. In Attention Compass, we refer to this workflow of capturing everything as that, capture. But the last thing you want, if you have an idea about something you should do or have an idea about a solution to a problem, last thing you want to do is to wait for your computer to boot up and pick a Word app versus an Excel app and then dump your data. The more steps you have to take to record an idea, the more likely it is that you're going to forget it. And you've seen this in your own life. You get up to go refill your water glass, go to the kitchen, set your glass down, recognize the dishes are in the sink, need to be in the dishwasher. And next thing you know, you've done 3 things and you get back to your desk and you've left your cup in the kitchen with no new water. Well, the same thing is true of trying to record ideas. And if we have to go through a bunch of steps to get there, then it's increasingly likely that that idea will evaporate because we've gotten distracted by something else. So have a single app that you can dump to. Just record the ideas. This is not a time for creative writing. Think about snippets, think about tweets, think about SMS, brief, just a note, right? So think about some way to do that in your own environment. And if it's paper, it's paper. Something that's reliable and fast. It allows you to get it out of your skull before you forget about it. The other thing that I've learned from Attention Compass, and this is because Attention Compass is currently platformed on Evernote. Evernote makes a different kind of filing system available to us. And any system with tags that work in certain ways will allow this. It's a multi-threaded filing system if you're able to use tags effectively. I know that Dropbox has the notion of tags. I know that OneNote has the notion of tags. I think Google Docs has the notion of tags, but it's very important that they work in certain ways and that we use them in certain ways in order to make this a filing system. But I will say, with Evernote, I haven't really used the Windows filing system to store my files, and this is all of my stuff, important stuff, not important stuff, whatever, gets filed away in Evernote. And it is much easier to organize in ways that make sense to me. And then finally, what I've learned from Attention Compass is don't be afraid of investing some attention in your productivity process and thinking about it. A lot of people are, well, I don't have time to think about my productivity. And it's very difficult to get better if you don't give getting better some of your attention. So we've talked about a bunch of ideas. I think the core takeaways are how technology gets better does not necessarily make us as knowledge workers better. And it's easy to fall into thinking that it does. And I would just say, don't necessarily fall into that thinking, but be an informed user of technology. And just because everybody else is doing something does not make it a good idea. And then some of the ideas that we talked about, right? Think about your processes, your knowledge work processes that don't involve the computer, because there you have some control over how you do things. And that may be an area where you can really change your productivity. And we talk about some of these ideas in the broader Attention Compass coaching. So I've given you some ideas about how to think about this. I hope I've helped you change your mindset a little bit around technology. I don't think technology is a bad thing. I think improper use of technology doesn't provide the best benefit. So I've tried to give you some tools and some frameworks to think about this as we go forward in search of greater knowledge worker productivity and in search of improving your productivity. I'll leave it there for now.
This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.